The Real AI Podcast with Michael Hainsworth is brought to you by Microsoft.
Real AI is making a real difference in shrinking the carbon footprint of generating electricity. Microsoft Sustainability Director Michelle Lancaster and VP of Energy Markets at Ontario Power Generation Nick Pender are working together to produce clean power for Canada's biggest province and to make consumption cleaner in the United States. 95% of Ontario's electricity generation is renewable, from Niagara Falls to the Kingston Solar Farm 400 kilometers away and everything in between. And using artificial intelligence, OPG is figuring out the best time to produce electricity and when to sell it to the coal-powered regions.
No, that's right. So we trade with our neighbours, with Quebec and New York, Michigan, Minnesota and Manitoba. But the 50% of what we generate in Ontario stays in the province. But just sometimes there's excess, and that's when our traders step up and look to buy from the Ontario market and sell into our neighbouring regions.
What creates that excess?
So the system's really designed to serve like on a hot summer's day or a cold winter. But when you're between the spring and the fall, you just don't need all that power to heat the homes and power our businesses. And that's when our traders step up and look at how we can manage that position and move clean power out of the province.
So you employ traders to trade the energy that we don't need?
We have these traders here. They have a lot of skill. And what they're trying to do is really reduce the carbon footprint for Ontario and our neighbours. And the way we do that is through importing and exporting power. It's a commercial mindset we apply, and we do that 24/7, 365.
So these traders aren't just aiming to get the best price for a kilojoule?
No, they don't. They do a bit more than that. They're trying to really take what they do and really lower the carbon footprint of Ontario and the neighbouring province, and or perhaps in the US. And they do that 24/7, 365.
This has been going on for years, a generation. What is it that makes artificial intelligence a critical tool for making all of this happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, traders have pretty much all the information they want at their fingertips, and they probably have more than they can deal with, and there's more insight and complexity. But what we really want them to be doing is making good, great, solid decisions. So using AI, supplementing their insight, and using it to sort of test their assumptions is what it's there.
Because I can imagine even a cloudy day can mess up a trader's day altogether.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. We have this joke, which is a cloud in Kingston can have a disproportionate effect, and you think, well, how does that work out? So we've had clouds since forever, and it's right, but now the system is more complicated than what it was. So if a cloud goes over, you can lose up to sort of 200 megawatts of load on the system, and 200 megawatts of load is 200,000 homes. And that can happen very easily. 20 years ago, that just didn't happen. And so thinking about how cloud cover and how wind changes the supply and demand of power is a really critical feature in how a trader trades.
You mentioned Kingston specifically and a cloud over at Kingston. That's because they've got that solar farm.
Correct, yeah. So the solar farms throughout the province, and, clouds move at a certain speed. And so you can pretty much track what's going to happen with a reasonable band of error. But if you can think about the geography and the landmass, that cloud has to go exactly over that farm. And there's inaccuracy in how clouds move because they're clouds,
But why is forecasting electricity prices so complicated? We were doing this before we had machine learning and AI.
It's a good question. You'd think with all the complexity and all the data that life gets easier, and it's kind of true. But the system used to be one way. It was from supply, and that would be static. But now you've got generators on one side and generators on the other side. So think about solar on the rooftops, electrification, maybe your EV charger. So you've got two sets of generation and variable demand in the middle, and that's all interacting. And that's the inherent complication in the system, and it changes, every 5 minutes.
It was described to me that forecasting electricity prices is like doing brain surgery on a moving boat.
Sorry, I think that's, I haven't really thought of it like that, but I think that's a very good way of describing it. it's complicated and you need steady hands. And in the same way that if you want to boat on either side, if you've got wind knocking you around, and you need that skill and that expertise to be calm when conditions are variable and changing. And that's what we employ our traders to do. We want to think carefully and calmly and manage the exposure that we've got to this changing power price. And that's how we use AI, and that's how we use the insight and the commercial mind of our traders.
So from the time in which Sir Adam Beck helped build Niagara Falls generating station in the 1800s to today, there are a lot more moving parts than there ever were before, and that's why you require this so-called data-driven trading platform?
Yes, so back in Sir Adam Beck's day, people with iPhones didn't have apps that can change how their car charged, turn the lights on at different times, maybe had battery packs on the wall. All this, exciting tech just didn't exist. The grid operator and the generators now have to really take that into account, because if there's hundreds of thousands of people all doing similar activities at slightly different times, it just changes that profile of demand. And really being on top of that is critical, because everyone wants the power there all the time. And the really interesting bit about power, I think for me, which separates it from everything else, is you just can't store it. I mean, you can put it in batteries and you can delay for a little bit, but not to the same degree which maybe you could, I don't know, a harvest or, a storable crop. It's real time. So that demand fluctuation and change has to be managed in real time.
So tell me, how has artificial intelligence made your life easier? Or has it made it more complicated?
I think it's a bit of both. So for me, there's new data, and that data in Ontario is a really good province for that, because there's huge amounts of public information that can be absorbed. And what we're really doing with the AI is we're kind of moving beyond the sort of classical rules of cause and effect. And by unbounding that process and taking a lot more information in, we can look for patterns that probably didn't exist before. And, like the computers run, the technology's there 24/7. It just doesn't get tired. So we're continuously reading that information and just looking to test. Have we made the right relationship? Have we thought about something? And we're really using that as a second check on our insight and our understanding, how we do it. So I think of it as a support or an aid to making better decisions, lower risk decisions.
So of course, when it comes to big data, the more data you have and the more variables you're working with, the more complex it is, but the more advanced an answer you can get out of this machine learning algorithm. I can imagine you're looking at variables like weather, time of day, the time of year, fuel prices. What are some of the other variables that we might not think that are going into this AI?
Great question. So we work in an interconnected market. So there's the obvious things you'd think that you can observe and see around you. As you said, sort of the wind, the solar, the time of day, behavior. But then we also connect our market to Quebec, to Manitoba, to Minnesota, to New York. And they have slightly different drivers at slightly different times. So perhaps people eat dinner at slightly different times, or it's slightly hotter in New York than it is here. Well, there's market signals happening at our borders. And so we have to compute all of that together and try and work out what's going to be happening ahead in the next period of time. And that's really where the kind of complexity comes in. My behavior and maybe your behavior magnified by, the eastern region is what we look at every day. And taking all those variables into account and computing them in a sensible way is what they're here to do.
I would have assumed that by throwing machine learning algorithms at all those variables in the complexity that you've never had before, that your life would be easier. But I was recently told that forecasting may actually be less accurate than the Stone Ages, but that it's that complexity that didn't exist in the Stone Ages that now requires AI.
People get surprised and they think, well, we've been doing this, since Sir Adam Beck was a boy. And it's kind of true, but the real-time demand and the importance of electricity in pretty much everything we do is really key. And the fact that it's hidden is the kind of the secret success of it. we don't really think about whether the power is going to be there. We just expect it to be there. In the same way that if broadband shuts off or the internet isn't available, it has an immediate impact. Well, it just doesn't happen all that often. And making sure that doesn't happen very often is the expertise that we have and that we've kind of come to expect.
Sometimes when it comes to the data you put into a machine learning algorithm, it outputs something you didn't expect. What are some of the things that you've experienced that you scratched your head at first and didn't realize what you were looking at?
I think probably the greatest example is, overnight we would expect demand to be low. And that's normal because a lot of people are at home and sleeping. I mean, businesses are open, but not as much as in the day. But what we started to see is batteries start to charge at night. So some of the algorithms, other folks' batteries kick in, and you can have a smooth demand profile all of a sudden peak up for maybe half an hour. And so, just this morning is a great example. At 5:30 in the morning, there was a peak, little mini peak on the system, entirely battery driven. That's just some behavioral effect of the way a system or aggregation is happening. And that has to be managed real time. And we see that all the time. And it's those little mini, just probably unintuitive things we're looking for. And this is, for me, where the AI is really helpful, because it helps you pause and think, oh, okay, this is interesting. What does it mean? And that, for me, is the value of it.
That's fascinating. It sounds like what you're telling me is that you have an artificial intelligence system you're working on that's trying to provide the most efficient means of trading electricity, but at the same time, there are other systems that are competing, that are saying, hey, it's cheap now. Now is the time to fuel up the battery, and that can really throw things out of whack.
Right. So if we all turn up to a shop at a certain time because it's a good time to go shopping, and hundreds of people turn up, it no longer becomes a good time. So looking at those, unbounding it and just forming non-classical relationships is what it's there to do. And we take the AI and we retrain it, so it has those data sources, and every week we're there just making sure it's just tuned up in the right way, and it's looking for those cause and effect between different systems, which is just more than weather, and it's just a little bit more than a supply-demand stuck in the power system.
So how does this come full circle back to delivering value to OPG customers?
So OPG is everything that we do goes back to our shareholder, which is the province. So the degree to which we make really good, efficient decisions means that flows straight back to the province. And for me, that's really the value of it. You want to be doing this activity so that as much value can be created for Ontario. That's what we focus on day in, day out.
I'd like to come back to something you mentioned earlier about how AI-powered electricity trading is reducing the carbon footprint in neighboring markets. How so?
Okay, so Ontario is a bit of a leader in this space, and we've got a really clean power system. We made the difficult decision a number of years ago to shut down our coal plants, and so our system is 95% clean electricity, so zero emission. So the degree to which we can export that when it makes sense to do so means it just lowers regional emissions. Like emissions don't care about borders, so whether it's happening above us, to the left or the right or below us is important to us. And so the degree to which we can use the low carbon electricity pragmatically and sensibly, for me, is a social good.
Can you quantify the impact of that?
I could ask the AI to see what it thinks about it and kind of cause those relationships. But day in, day out, what we're looking at trying to do is really avoid poor decisions, manage risk, and do that in a more sensible way. And we're at the start of the journey on it, and I can see it only getting better as more complexity kind of comes into the system. So, on a dollars and cents, can you make the direct comparison today? It's extremely difficult. Does it feel like it's the right direction, and do you feel more empowered and more in control? 100%.
Meantime, over at Microsoft, Michelle Lancaster points out that any company's goal of being carbon neutral or carbon negative is a group effort.
it is incredibly important to realize that getting to carbon negative and achieving the Paris targets is a group goal. It's also really important to understand how important individual action is along that. In environmental sustainability, we've often seen the need for collective effort be a reason that some lead and most sit behind. That's not a place that we can afford to be in given the time that we have left to really fight climate change. So as we look towards the next 8 or 9 years, which are really pivotal to put our planet back on the right path, we see a role for everyone to take up the charge of climate change and sustainability inside their business, but also to work outside of your business with your supply chain, with your consumers, with your customers, and with your regulators. We all have different spheres of influence and we all have different roles to play, but we all need to do them and not wait for anybody else to take the lead.
That's an interesting point. When making a decision about being carbon neutral or carbon negative, we have to think about the supply chain in achieving this goal.
Very much so. Most companies have the bulk of their emissions in what we call Scope 3 emissions or in their supply chain. Microsoft is no different. Our Scope 1 emissions, what we actually emit on campus and in our facilities, is really small. It's about 100,000 tons of CO2 a year. Our electricity consumption or our Scope 2 emissions are much larger than that, but they're still at about 3 million. The remaining about 12 million metric tons of CO2 that Microsoft has resides up and down our supply chain. And so if you don't have a target that is looking at your supply chain, encouraging your suppliers to act differently and reduce the consumption of energy from your devices, you don't really have a real net zero target.
So how do you get them on board?
It is not easy. I think this is a space where everyone wants to do the right thing, but it's also really difficult to determine what the most right thing is or the most right way to participate. We found that technology, no surprise to Microsoft, can play a really important role in making that easier for suppliers. First, by onboarding suppliers into an easy to report system. If you're a downstream supplier, think about a smelter that we would use to put together tungsten into lithium ion batteries. Their level of sophistication on greenhouse gas reporting is not great because it's not a core part of their job. So we want to make that easier where they can only supply the information that they actually know, and then technology through common data models on calculation and greenhouse gas equivalencies can do that conversion for them. So we're making it easy to participate and removing some of the human error at the same time. We also think technology has a role to play of getting out of that self-reporting altogether. There have been tremendous breakthroughs in things like satellite and sensor technology in recent years, where we can actually see virtually the amount of emissions from a particular area and to be able to understand how that electricity grid or other actions are actually reducing carbon. In the instance of energy providers, same thing with methane, with dairy farmers, methane and other substances. So make it really easy to try to get our suppliers on board and then try to find ways that we can either double check that work or make it easier to just have us do it on our own.
It sounds like the evolution of industrial IoT, Internet of Things. It's really a contributing player in ensuring that not only the supply chain achieves the goals, but we all do.
Absolutely. I think we've long thought of industrial IoT as the province of smart factories in a way to get dirty manufacturing less dirty. It turns out that sane optimization and clarity and transparency is useful to everyone. A little bit of sunlight deep down in the supply chain actually does permeate all the way up to corporate goals when you have the right flow of information and technology across the board. So instead of having a plant manufacturer down the line and say, Microsoft's facilities report on that, if we've already outfitted that factory with sensors, not only do we know how to operate that 24/7, 365 by using less energy, we're also getting that data in real time so we can see how that's actually tracking against our emissions. And we also remove that sort of human error, human element once you're reporting. I think that's the deep, dark, dirty secret of sustainability reporting is that we have loads of data coming in, but it's siloed across the organization. And so most organizations only pull that data together once a year, usually in the form of a sustainability report to say, this is how we're doing. As business and sustainability become deeply intertwined and sustainability data becomes critical to business operation, executive compensation, ratings by Wall Street, that kind of reporting cycle won't work anymore. And so really starting to take those steps now to build out data infrastructures that can easily ingest data are going to become just as important as those advanced supply chain tools are for every company right now.
And once you've got that big data in your system from a whole bunch of different sources, you can leverage artificial intelligence to help achieve your goals. Microsoft, for example, you are 4 years away from using 100% renewable energy. What does AI do to help?
AI has a really big role to play in renewable energy. It starts from kind of start to finish, really from we're using AI with our energy providers and suppliers to determine most optimal siting for new renewable energy facilities that come online. So, not just how proximate they are to our data centers, but adjusting a turbine, a wind turbine, even just 15 degrees can generate a lot more electricity or a lot less electricity. You need to understand weather patterns, climate patterns, wind patterns, a whole lot of data to make a smart siting decision so you get the most bang for your buck. And it just continues from there. It is not as easy as just making sure that the electrons flowing into your data center are green. We are doing that work by working with utilities and doing that work. But it's also making sure that as grids change overall and they become more software dependent, that we can play a role in that. So we're also using AI with our utility providers to get to what we refer to as 24/7 data. So really understanding how many emissions are being generated by a grid at any particular time, so we can make our own decisions about using our backup batteries that don't have the same level of carbon emissions if solar or wind drop on the electricity grid. And then finally, we're using AI across the board as we start to look at how to improve our data centers overall. That old axiom about the best energy you save is the energy you never use turns out to be true. And so using AI to make sure that we're actually optimizing the servers and the way that we do compute for this information and the data that's coming through our data centers is just as important as making sure we actually get those renewable sources online.
It seems counterintuitive. You can make real hard change using software.
That's true. It turns out efficiency is kind of this wonderful thing where it's got a really high return on value up until a certain point, and then you can't kind of squeeze any more efficiency out of things. So we can definitely make sure that we are still continuing to optimize and improve, use software to drive changes about how whole data centers operate, all the way down to individual server components. But at some point, they still have to pull electricity. And until the world's grid, or all of the grids around the world, I should say, are fully electrified with renewable energy, we are going to have to play on both sides of the ledger. And that's why you see hyperscale companies like Microsoft and Google equally talking about the importance of optimization, as well as trying to build out the infrastructure that we rely on.
So it's one thing to set a goal, but let's expand on how you monitor your progress to ensure you're achieving it.
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I think as we have started to see new regulations emerge, we here in the United States are looking at the SEC considering proposals to actually require companies to transparently report on their progress on a year-over-year basis, just as they do with financial reporting. In other places, including Canada and the EU, things like carbon taxes are trying to drive that same level of transparency in different ways. One way or the other, we do think that the pressure on companies not just to set targets, but to report on that progress and report on it in increasingly granular ways is going to become sort of table stakes and increasingly regulated. That is why we have spent so much time looking at how we can actually do a better job ourselves as Microsoft of showing the investments that we've made and the benefits it delivers to customers through something we call the sustainability calculator that shows cloud customers their saved carbon emissions from using Microsoft services compared to an on-premise provider. We're looking at rolling that out across a number of our other services as well. So when you make a Teams call instead of actually driving in person to take a meeting, that also has carbon emissions. So help giving that information in real time to consumers, but also using that to actually build out our back-end telemetry. And what I said earlier about sort of data requirements, we see that systems of record on sustainability are really going to become the new norm. And that is a mix of AI and data, but also really some core business insights and type of like ERP style solutions that are going to become really important in the next couple of years.
The thing is, sometimes there's no environmentally friendly alternative energy, like aviation fuel. How do we square that circle?
That is it's a multi-front problem that we're trying to attack that way. But what we do right now as Microsoft, for the things that we can't reduce or replace that are well outside of our control or simply don't have an alternative right now, we are looking at purchasing carbon removal. So actual projects that suck carbon out of the air, whether that is a soil project, a forest project, or increasingly engineered solutions that do the same thing, to make sure that that emission is neutralized. But we're not done with that just yet. There are alternatives to aviation fuel. Right now, they're very expensive. They're somewhere, they're orders of magnitude more expensive than traditional jet fuel, and they're only available in really small quantities. And so that's where our commitment can actually help play a really catalytic role across the board. We're signaling market demand by saying we would really like to purchase a sustainable aviation fuel or engage in that market. We've already done 3 deals, one with Alaska, one with KLM, and an expansion of the deal with KLM around sustainable aviation fuel to cover our own business travel. And then finally, we're joining voices with others. We just joined the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, which is a group of companies like us that are willing to pay a bit more for alternatives to aviation fuel, but really need to see that price curve drop down and the demand pipe up. So we're looking at how can we use our commitments to catalyze the market, how can we use our capital to prove that there are actually purchasers there, and then how do we also use our technology to just reduce the use of that overall. The last year and a half has taught us a lot about what we can rely on teams to rather than hopping on a flight. We will be back up in the skies. Our salespeople love closing deals in person, and the value of in-person meetings is really valuable. But there's a way out of all of the fuels that don't have alternatives, but it's going to take time and investment, and probably some technology innovation too.
On the topic of time, Microsoft is committed to being carbon negative by 2030. Time's a ticking. What needs to happen next to make that possible?
Well, we've outlined the progress that we've made to date in our sustainability report that we published in January of this year. All 96 pages of it, including about 5 pages of a very detailed data appendix that show where we've been in FY18, 19, and FY20. We'll be publishing that on an annual basis. For us, what happens next is really focus in 3 areas. Making aggressive cuts in emissions from our supply chain. As I mentioned, it's a huge chunk of our overall emissions, and we've committed to not just purchasing our way out of that problem, but actually cutting our emissions in our supply chain by more than half. Figuring out how to do that in a cost-effective way that actually results in lowered emissions is job 1, 2, and 3 for us this year. It's that important and it's that big of a job. So we're looking at alternatives for our suppliers to purchase renewable energy. We're investing heavily in reducing the energy consumption of our own devices, so making sure that that Xbox, even though it's plugged into the wall all the time, is pulling less and less energy. Same thing with our devices. And then really looking hard at how we can apply better data quality measures across all of that. We think it's 12 million, but a lot of those things rely on estimates of emissions, or they rely on industry averages. And so we really need to deepen our data quality in order to make strides on our supply chain side. And then we need to really keep moving on renewable energy and carbon removal. We are, pretty optimistic about our ability to continue purchasing renewable energy at scale over the next year. There have been huge improvements in that across the US and Europe, but we're increasingly expanding into areas where renewable energy is less prevalent, and we have a lot of work to do as we continue to expand the cloud into places where internet consumption is rising, that there are renewable energy projects that are as plentiful in Texas and Jakarta, for example, that we can cover both sides of that. And then really looking at carbon removal as making sure that we still have high quality projects. So it's supply chain, data, purchase right now.
Let's talk specifically about Ontario Power Generation. It moved to a cloud-based platform. How did that help lower carbon emissions?
Yeah, and what we've seen with Ontario Power is something that we've seen from our own experience, which is why we started rolling it out to our customers. That move to cloud does a couple of things. The first is that when you have a hyperscale environment like Microsoft, we've built more than 120 data centers around the world. We'd like to think we're pretty good at it now. We've learned a few things along the way since we started building. So a shift from an on-premise data center into a hyperscale environment gets you a couple of things. First, you get to benefit from the investments that we've already made in improving energy efficiency in the overall operation of that data center. You benefit from the investments that Microsoft has made as a large purchaser of servers. So we're all the way down to the chip level of thinking about how much power we can get out of that chip. You also get the benefits of efficiency from our software teams that are consistently thinking about right-sizing application for that particular thing. As much as it is cool to have that much power, we need to really right-size those things. And so we have algorithms that are already built into how we operate data centers that right-size those things. And then finally, you also get to benefit from that renewable energy investment. And so what we've seen with Ontario is what we've seen across the board. In a research paper we published in 2018, we found that just the 4 sort of most carbon hungry applications, so SharePoint, Exchange, and then both kinds of data storage, we're seeing up to about a 92% energy efficiency saving in a shift from a traditional on-prem to an Azure environment, and up to 98% improvement in carbon efficiency. And what's really interesting to us is that I mentioned renewable energy last in that sort of benefit list, and that's intentional because it's actually the smallest slice of that pie wedge. It's really the investments that we're making from chip to server rack to overall efficiency, and then bolstered by our investments in renewable energy. We, in fact, just about a month ago, launched a Green Software Foundation with Accenture that is intended to build out sort of principles and rules of the road, what I mentioned about right-sizing code for purpose, to really instill that and enshrine that. We can make beautiful products that have amazing sustainability benefits, but if they're requiring a large amount of power or pulling a lot of power from a data center that's not fully green, we haven't really solved the problem. And so we're really looking at attacking sustainability from, code to Kubernetes cluster to cloud, all the way to endpoint solutions with our customers.
Michelle Lancaster is the Director of Sustainability for Microsoft. Nick Pender is the Vice President of Energy Markets at Ontario Power Generation. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the Real AI Podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe today and visit Microsoft.com/AI to see exciting real-world examples of real AI in use today.